Good. How are you?
I'm okay. I'm okay. I had a super long meeting, like almost 5 hours this morning. So I'm glad to be out of that and here with you. So this is our live session with, superstar of the study of both the manuscripts of the Quran and the language of the Quran. I said both, but now I'm thinking of a third thing as well, because the transmission and the reading traditions. So all three of those things. Dr. Marijn van Putten. And we're here not only to chat with Marijn, but also, since we're live, to get your questions. And I think Hassan is there in the background. Hassan, still haven't seen messages coming through, just so you know. But go ahead, you can start typing your questions in, and we'll be responding to those in the second half. We're going to go 60 minutes. So right now in Indiana, it's noon. And Dr. Van Putten joins us from Europe, so I guess probably 6 p.m. for you
6
there.
p.m. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly 6 p.m. Yeah.
And
we'll see. We'll see if my laptop holds it for an hour, because I just had a power outage, so I'm running on the battery alone.
running on battery.
But we'll go as long as we can, and maybe the electricity returns. So we'll see.
Okay, awesome. So everyone, Marijn van Putten has been with us before on exploring the Quran and the Bible. So look at the earlier talk, and they're actually connected. Marijn reminded me how. Anyway, I'll explain in a bit what we're going to speak about today and what I'm about to mention about his current work is connected to that moment when we had that first interview. Yeah, so Marijn is assistant professor at the Leiden University Centre for Linguistics, and the Leiden University Centre or Institute for Area Studies. He works on all sorts of things. I mean, really influential book. He had a huge article about grace of God that had a lot to do with the question of the canonization and codification of the Quran by Uthman, by one single institution. But then, in 2022, published with Brill Quranic Arabic from its Hijazi origins to its classical reading traditions. That's what we spoke about in the first interview. We're going to be speaking about, three different things. I'll mention that in a moment. But I mean, the big news is that Marijn is the lead investigator and the director of a massive project, known as the ERC, which is like, I guess like the Ark of the Covenant for academics in Europe to get your hands on an ERC. And his project is Qurcan, Qurcan, the canonization of the Quranic reading traditions. And I guess, Marijn, you actually got the yes for that when we were speaking on this channel last time.
Yes, that's right. So last time we spoke, during our talk, I got to email that I got the grant. I'm very glad I did not see that as we were talking, because I would have been much too distracted to finish that conversation. But that was a really good, a really great thing to know. And so I was just reminded of that. So it's now almost 3 years into the project, so I'm over halfway. Doesn't necessarily always feel like that, but we'll see. Hopefully it'll all come to an end in a great way.
Yeah, so I'll be asking some questions about the project, which will bring us to the question of, what is the text of the Quran? What does it look like? And then how do you read that text? What are the possibilities? So I'll be asking about that. I'm going to chat with Marijn for 20-25 minutes, and then there are already questions coming through. Thank you, George, for that question. Others people asking questions, and I've also got some questions that were submitted in advance that we'll talk about. So there'll be at least 30 minutes for us to discuss your questions for Dr. Van Putten. But let me start with this one. There's a whole bunch of videos out there. Amazingly, there's more than one, I think, Marijn, which announced
and a bunch of different languages too.
Yeah, so this European researcher has been paid 2 million euros to find a mistake in the Quran, and he couldn't do it. He failed. What the heck is going on with all of that?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. So this seems to be a kind of amalgamation of, well, first of all, me getting this ERC grant. So to say, the ERC paid him 2 million euros. Well, first of all, I mean, yes, I did actually get 2 million euros for a grant. It had nothing to do with finding mistakes in the Quran. It is this Qurcan project that I'm working on now. That research also currently isn't finished. It's a 5-year project, and it's a how many, well, we have a huge team. It's hard to count because some people come in and out of the project over time. But so it's a bunch of people. So it's also not just me sitting on a big wad of cash, right? Kind of enjoying my 2 million. That's being divided. A quarter of it goes to the university for overhead, and then the rest of it I can divide up across student assistants, PhD students, postdocs. So all of that is going on. And
I mean, it was almost before you started that they announced you had already
yes, almost
do something you didn't even try to do.
Right. And it seems to come from this kind of clipped message that I did on another video where I said, where I said something like, the Quranic text is incredibly stable, which it is. At least the standard text is very stable. And I said something like, it'd be cool if I could find like variations, but I can't because they're not there, at least on a consonantal skeleton level. And that somehow got conflated. I mean, that's just me just saying, like, wouldn't it be cool if, you find these, like the woman taken in adultery suddenly being gone in some of the earliest manuscripts of the Bible, right? And that kind of stuff just isn't there in the Quran, which is cool and interesting on its own. And they kind of ran with that and connected that to the ERC thing just as I got the grant. So, I hadn't even been paid basically at the time that they ran with that. And it had nothing to do with my project. I mean, this point about the stability of the text is, of course, related to my Grace of God article, where I basically talk about that, which was finalized in 2018. My project started in 2023. I mean, that's so hard for me to keep count of these things. I think that's right. And so it's a very strange kind of convalescence of weird stories and things. And now it's out there in like 6 billion different languages, and obviously there's nothing you can do to kind of counteract this kind of misinformation. But I can talk a little bit about what the project is actually about.
I mean, can we, if it's okay, I mean, we can go there if you want to start with. That's totally cool with me as well. But because you already mentioned kind of the stable text, and then you use these words consonantal and skeletal text. So I'd like to speak about that, but then also could you explain, that there are traditional stories about the third caliph, so the third political successor of the Prophet Muhammad. He was the one who established this text. So could you speak about like the text itself and then the stories and how they go together?
Sure. So the Quran, well, obviously is supposed to be a record of the oral revelations of the Prophet Muhammad. And by traditional stories, only a standard text really gets established under the third caliph Uthman. About, what is it, like 20, maybe 30 years after the death of the Prophet? Probably 20, close to 20, around the 650s.
Yeah, 650. Yep.
Yeah. And so before that time, there clearly was a bunch of variation. We have reports and transmissions of variations. We have one very famous manuscript, the Sana Palimpsest, which actually has a lower text which deviates from the standard text, different surah order, different wording, still like recognizably the Quran. And with Uthman, he standardized the text. At least that's a tradition, and I think that tradition is true. But let's keep story and proof apart here. And he sent out these copies, master copies of the Quran, which then get copied over and over and over again. And so you can show by looking at these manuscripts that they are incredibly close, so close, in fact, that they must have been copied from a single archetype. And
by these
so
manuscripts, you mean the reports about the manuscripts that were sent out to different cities.
Yes. So there were right these reports of these copies, and I think looking at actual manuscripts, you can kind of prove this, right? We can show
Okay.
that all these manuscripts are so similar to one another that they must have been copied
From a
very
single source.
carefully from a single source. And even we can see, and this is something that Haitham Sidki, who's also been on the channel, has worked on, we can even see that there are 4 regional versions of this Quranic text, of this archetype, which were indeed present in Syria, Kufa, Basra, and Medina. So all of that kind of fits this idea. There was a single standardizing moment, and from that point onwards, they were sent across the Islamic Empire, and from there they kept on copying. And so all of that works out quite nicely. The big question, of course, is, was it Uthman that did it? I think most scholars are coming in line with that idea, and I think there's good reasons for it. So partially it fits this story quite nicely, this idea of a single canonization then being spread across the things. You can make certain arguments from the literature that it makes sense. But I think also the manuscript record really supports this. The radiocarbon dating of a bunch of early manuscripts, which are all of the standard text type, the Uthmanic text type, seem to really predate the other obvious contender in this story, which is Abdul Malik or Hajjaj's governor, who come later at the early Umayyad period.
End of the 7th century.
Yes, end of the 7th century, I should say. So the radiocarbon dating really makes it quite difficult to make that work with them, unless we think all of the radiocarbon datings that come before them are wrong somehow, which is hard to make sense of. But there's even a couple of very nice arguments. This is something De Roche has made.
François de Roche, French professor,
François de Roche,
Collège de France.
Yes, indeed. Who has this very nice book. It's called The Qurans of the Umayyads, where he shows, well, look, there's this group of manuscripts that appears that have a different script style, and has this kind of ornamentation. The ornamentation looked just like typical mosaics that we, for example, see on the Dome of the Rock, which was built during the Umayyad period. It uses a script style that Abdul Malik starts using in milestones and on the Dome of the Rock as well, which we see in these manuscripts. And then we have a bunch of manuscripts that are clearly earlier than those manuscripts. So these clearly look Umayyad. So the ones that are earlier than that must be pre-Umayyad. And I think that's a pretty good argument from a kind of art historical perspective as well for an early canonization. Now, we can't distinguish whether it was Uthman or Muhammad, really, but there's nothing to suggest that Muhammad did it. And the fact that we have at least one text that deviates from the standard text seems to suggest there was a period of a bit more instability,
flux
and then
instability.
And then a moment where it kind of comes together in a standard text.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question too. Like I jumped in by saying flux and instability, but actually we only have this one. And it's, as you mentioned, a palimpsest, which means a manuscript that has 2 layers of writing, and it's not the layer writing, it's on the lower writing, and then there's another Quranic manuscript written on top of that. So lots of things to talk about that, but just to cover our bases, and I want to get to your ERC project. So what does it mean when you say that these early manuscripts present the skeletal or consonantal text of the Quran? Folks here, on this channel, may not know these terms, may not read Arabic. So what does that mean, skeletal or consonantal text? Yeah.
So if you look at the Arabic scripts, anyone who does that even today, you'll see that it's kind of a squiggly line, right? And then there's these dots on top and below the letters.
Yes,
and these
that's
dots,
I usually use those words. Yeah, squiggly line, right. Dots. Yes,
it's a squiggly line with dots, right?
Exactly.
And so these dots, these distinguish a lot of different letters. So the difference between a ya and a ta is purely one of dots, and even the ba and a na in certain environments is purely because of dots. And those dots, even though they seem to have been around even early on already, were used extremely irregularly in this early period. So in our earliest manuscripts, all of them have some amount of dots. It's a famous, I think, misunderstanding that they don't have any dots. But it's not enough to be able to unambiguously read the text if you don't know what it's supposed to say. So, the difference between ta'lamun and ya'lamun at the beginning of a word can vary, and you could read it differently depending on what you want to read and what you are supposed to read or what you think you're supposed to read. And so that's kind of what we talk about with a skeletal text. We basically say the kind of basic outline of the text, of basically the squiggle without the dots or with very few dots or not enough dots to really be able to read the text unambiguously.
Yeah,
On
so,
top
I
of
mean,
that,
yep, please,
go ahead.
please carry on.
Oh.
Carry on.
So and on top of that, Arabic scripts at this point didn't have any way to write vowels at all. And obviously, to be able to speak, you do need vowels, at least if you don't speak Berber or Moroccan Arabic. And those weren't written either, right? So there's these questions of what vowels are we supposed to read here? What consonants are we supposed to read here? So there is a standard text, but there is a certain amount of ambiguity in that text, more so than even, I would say, Hebrew, which doesn't write vowels, at least in the earliest stages, but their consonants are a lot less ambiguous than in the Arabic script.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so then we're talking about sort of two open questions. So we have the standard consonantal text. You gave good reasons why scholars generally, follow kind of the traditional date of the formation of that text around 650, Uthman. Really, consistency around the manuscript, the actual manuscript evidence. So about, the texts are basically all unified, with the one exception of that Sena or text found in Yemen. And then there's the two dimensions of ways in which you can read that one text. So if we forget about Yemen for a second, I mean, not the country, but just that manuscript, so we have this one standard consonant or skeletal text of the Quran, and it's kind of there, I think, where your project, your ERC project, Qur'an, let me just get the full name, Canonization of the Quranic Reading Traditions, where that comes in, right? Because if you have that very basic text, as you said, there's two open questions. One is completing the writing to get the consonants, and then vocalizing or adding the vowels. So, I mean, how is your project related to this? What is the end game? What is the goal of the project?
Right. So the goal is no. I was going to make a joke about to find mistakes in the Quran, but no, that's not it. The goal of the Quran is the goal.
Someone
of the
is definitely going to take that one.
Yes, exactly.
Cut this out of this video. Sorry.
So the goal is basically, so the text is technically ambiguous on how to read it. So the question is, how do you read it? Now, the tradition gives us multiple answers. So today we say there are about 10 canonical reading traditions, so in Arabic that will be qira'at, the singular qira'ah. 10 canonical reading traditions, which are all quite different in how they're interpreted. And so these differences should not be overstated, but for linguists, they're extremely interesting because a lot of the differences are on a linguistic level. So do you pronounce these vowels a? Do you pronounce it as a? This stuff is something linguists like me get very excited about. But to some extent, also some difference in actual meaning, right? Is it a third person or a second person verb? These kinds of things show up in that text. And so we have, even within the canon, even what's considered canonical, there are 10 different answers on how to read this text. And that is an oversimplification because all of them have at least two canonical transmission paths, which differ very minorly from one another for most readers, but nevertheless, there's differences there. So how do you read the Quran, and how were people reading the Quran in the past? Because this idea that there's 10 canonical reading traditions, that's kind of a 15th century idea. Before that, there were 7 reading traditions, which really took hold with a man named Ibn Mujahid, who lived in the 4th century in Baghdad.
4th century Hijri, just to be clear.
4th century Hijri. 10th century. Yes, thank you.
In the standard day.
Yes, 410. So in the 10th century. And so after Ibn Mujahid, most people are like, okay, yeah, the 7 are great. They still keep on adopting other reading traditions as well, but at least the 7 is something that people are kind of agreeing upon. But the question is, what was going on before Ibn Mujahid? Because Ibn Mujahid, we're talking about the 10th century, which is quite far away from the 7th century that we were talking about. And this project is interested in bridging that gap. What was going on before that time? We're doing that from different directions. So we're looking at the literary record. This is something especially my postdoc Jeremy Farrell is doing, but I'm also doing quite a bit with that. And also from the manuscript record, because that's the cool thing. So Ibn Mujahid is a description of 7 reading traditions, which are now considered canonical. Not quite in his rendition, but that's details. But that's the earliest book on the reading traditions that we have at all. So 300 years or more after the fact, we get a description of 7 reading traditions of people who lived about 150 years before that. But if that's our bottleneck, how do we know what was going on before that? How were people reading the Quran before that?
Right.
Now, there's a way to actually know this from primary sources from before that period, because we have manuscripts.
And as you said,
like I said,
they actually have dots.
Yes.
They actually have
Yes,
more than the
yes.
skeletal consonantal script.
Yes. And at some point, we don't know exactly when, but it must be near the end of the 7th century, beginning of the 8th century, they start developing these colored dots in the text that they start adding to the text. And these signify vowels. And to understand how to read the text, the vowels are by far the most important, because that's where the most variation is happening. And so at that moment, we can start looking at how did this person who vocalized this manuscript understand.
So just
text,
can I jump in, Marijn? Just to clarify for folks, who may may still be kind of trying to asking themselves, what are the dots in Arabic script? So we spoke about how in, say, standard printed Arabic today, the dots are usually connected to finishing a consonant, but in these early manuscripts, so basically I guess pre-10th century manuscripts, we're talking about a different kind of dots. These ones tend to have different colors, which is already cool. And now they represent vowels, which in modern printed Arabic is usually slashes and stuff, right?
No. Yes. Yes. So the system is quite a bit different, and it confuses people because what are now dots used to look like slashes, so it's kind of got flipped around in a way, and people get quite confused about this. But the system is really cool. You can do a lot of stuff with it. And one thing that we've been doing in a project is actually collecting a database of these vocalized manuscripts, transcribing them, so that we can compare them and look at them and search through them. At some point, that's going to go public. It's not there yet, but it's really exciting to actually be able to see and compare these manuscripts with one another to get a sense of like, okay, what were popular readings at the time? What were some of the ways that people were doing this? Can we see certain regional trends here? And some of that really does seem to be working. We see some stuff that looks more Basran and other stuff that looks more Medinan, in the ways they read certain words that are.
Now, when you say Basra Medinan,
one way or the other,
someone just put in the chat, "We love you, Marijn." I don't know if you could see the chat messages coming through.
Yes, I did. I did. Yes.
All right. But when you say Basra Medinan, you're now speaking about the traditions of reading, right? Not the traditions about Uthman sending out manuscripts.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
And these become associated with particular.
No, exactly. We're talking about
particular men, particular readers,
cities.
And then Basra is a city in Iraq, Medina,
so,
obviously.
So from the let's say from the tradition, we have a couple of names, right? So we know that Abu Ja'far was a Medinan reader. We know that Nafi' was a Medinan reader. And we compare these manuscripts to them, and very often they don't fit exactly, but they fit them closer than, say, readers that we know from Basra or readers that we know from Kufa. And with that way, you can kind of triangulate where is this reading coming from. But what's really exciting to me, at least, about this is these manuscripts that are vocalized. So someone wrote down a specific reading they had in mind. And the vast majority of the time, they don't fit any reading that we know, which I think is really exciting. So, this is not so surprising. This is before there's a canonization. But the idea that, even before Ibn Mujahid, say, Nafi' was the only game in town in Medina, or that Abu Amr was the only game in town in Basra, just doesn't seem to be true. We see tons of different variation and lots of variation, even with manuscripts that look quite similar to one another, that you just cannot get out of just the literary record, which is so much later.
Yeah, so the later reports
still
in
here?
books
Getting a tiny
about
feedback.
qira'at or readings, which, you know, you'd have like a printed Arabic book. I see a mushaf in front of me, but I'm trying to, yeah, like, and later on you could buy, this is not a qira'at, but, you know, you have a book like this, you know, be filled with reports of what readings might look. But now your project, Qurcan, the canonization of it, the Quranic readings. By the way, all this will be linked in the description when the time comes that, you know, you're able to share. But I think already there's probably a site people can look at to get a better idea of your project. Now, you know, folks will say, wait a second, Dr. Van Putten, if I go to a bookstore, or more likely, you know, go online to get, you know, look at some website or a PDF, my text looks exactly the same wherever I go. Every single vowel is exactly the same. What the heck are you talking about of different ways of reading the text? Could you just, I know it's a complicated story, but briefly, how would you answer?
No, I mean, it's not super complicated in the sense that it's simply not true, not even today. So if you go to North Africa and you buy a mushaf there, that's a copy of the Quran, for those who don't know that jargon. It will have a different reading from if you go to Turkey, or probably if you buy one in Europe. I mean, here in the Netherlands, it's a bit more complicated because we have a lot of Moroccans here, so they like their warsh and nafi'. But there are different reading traditions. They're not exactly identical, even today. And obviously, this is the result of, let's say, 2,000 years of canonization towards kind of a, you know, bringing together of a canon of like, these are the people we consider, you know, the most authentic. For whatever reason, it's very difficult to reconstruct exactly where these sense of authenticity come from, but nevertheless, these are the most authentic. And obviously, the further you go back in time, less of these things were established, and obviously there's going to be more variation. There were not only 10 people who knew how to read the Quran, right, at the time that, say, Nafi' was alive or Abu Amr was alive, who were two canonical readers. There were other people in Basra, and they weren't all just flocking to him. And if they were all flocking to him after he was born, they certainly weren't when he wasn't born yet, right? And so this is where this kind of variation comes from. It only makes sense that the variation actually only increases the further you go back in time in that sense.
Yes. Okay. One last question from me, and then we're going to turn to some of the questions in the chat, and one that was sent to me beforehand. So, I mean, to circle back to the controversy about the 2 million euros and all of that, like, so why is this different than a quest to find mistakes in the Quran?
Well, so I'm not interested in the mistakes per se, or in mistakes at all. And even as a linguist, that question doesn't make all that much sense. So, you know, in linguistics, we don't believe in mistakes, because what is language if not a agreement to understand one another?
Okay.
And those things differ in different places, but everyone has an internal grammar, and that might not agree with some kind of standard that some person up high decided, but it's like, who am I to judge what is correct or what is wrong in that sense, right? There's nothing inherently wrong to say, you know, I ain't an American instead of I'm not an American. Some people might consider that wrong, and that's certainly non-standard, but it communicates the exact same thing, right? And there's plenty of people who use I ain't instead of I'm not as a way of speaking English. And you know, you can do countless examples of that in Arabic, in Dutch, and whatever. There's not a single language without variation, and there's not a single language that leads with a kind of standard language ideology that doesn't have some idea of what is correct and what is wrong.
Lots of jokes and lots of TV shows about you know, people speaking different ways,
exactly.
the same language, different ways,
with, right. And so the idea of a linguistic mistake just doesn't make sense. What's interesting is that because Arabic does have a strong standard language ideology, the medieval grammarians themselves do call things wrong, where I'm like, well, I mean, there's a perfectly good way of understanding this, but they have a sense of like, some things are the way you're supposed to do this, and there's some ways that you're not supposed to do this. And interestingly, they're perfectly happy to say this even about canonical reading traditions. So even Ibn Mujahid, the canonizer of the 7 reading traditions, says for a bunch of readings, oh, this doesn't make any sense, this is wrong, this is bad, this is a mistake. And like, not a lot of them, but you know, it's like 30 of them in the book. So clearly they have a sense of what is wrong and what is right. But to me, it's like that's an interesting sociological phenomenon.
So yeah,
But
there
it
are
doesn't tell us
rules, right?
anything about.
I'm sorry,
Well,
I jumped
there are
in. Yeah,
rules.
go ahead.
Yes, yes. No, go ahead. So
I was
there
just
are
going to say
rules. I mean,
one of
there
the
are
rules
rules.
is that
Yeah.
you can't violate the Uthmanic Codex. Like that's the big one, right?
Yes,
Or
yes.
maybe there's
Oh,
a bigger,
certainly,
but
certainly.
that's definitely a big
Right.
one.
That's definitely a rule. So there are rules, and even there are grammatical rules. But the question is, whose grammatical rules are they, right? So presumably, any native speaker, like native speakers, don't make mistakes, right? I might make mistakes when I'm speaking English to you, but as a Dutch speaker, when I speak Dutch, I just speak the way I was taught, right? This is
You're
my
Dutch.
first language.
Yeah.
I'm Dutch. That's what I should.
Yeah.
And so, so the
sorry, I
idea
meant
of a
you're
mistake
like
is
YOUR. You speak the Dutch that you speak, right? It's yeah.
yes, exactly. Yes, no, in that sense, right? And so I speak my Dutch, indeed, right? And so you will speak your English, and that's not necessarily exactly the same as someone else. And some of those things might be felt as mistakes, and some of these things might be felt as correct. But who decided that? It's just some old geezer, probably a dude, a couple of 100 years ago, and it's like, well, there's no reason why we take these things seriously from a descriptive perspective. And there is no such thing as grammar outside of its speakers, right? There's no, and this might get into some theology, but there's no such thing as a kind of Platonic ideal of what correct language is without its speakers, right? A language cannot be correct without it being spoken. So the idea that such a thing as a mistake really exists is just really a nonsensical question to me. So I'm not looking for mistakes because it doesn't make sense.
That's very, very interesting. Yeah, explanation of all of that. And one can easily see a theological dimension because, as you know, in Islamic tradition, there are debates about, does God speak Arabic? Does he speak some sort of divine language that's translated by the angel? Did Arabic develop historically as other languages did, or is it some kind of original language? Let me resist talking too much about that. There's lots of questions coming up. One member of Exploring the Quran and the Bible, I love you members, wrote the following. This is a question from Inquisitive Mind. It's connected, I think, to your book, but also kind of connected to the project. Who Hamza'd the Quran or the Quran if Muhammad and his companions were from the Hijaz? And when was it back projected to Muhammad?
Right. Yeah. So there's a bunch of details in this very detailed question, but it's a nice one, actually. So what is the Hamza? The Hamza is what linguists call a glottal stop, or as we like to joke, a glottal stop, right? This sound, which is a very British way of saying glottal. And so this sound is in all of the canonical reading traditions. It's there to a lesser extent and a larger extent in multiple places. So if we take common reading traditions today, a believer in the reading of Hafs would be mu'min, and a believer in the reading of Warsh would be mu'min, without the hams. So there's places where there's differences, but all of them have hams to some extent. But if we go to the grammarians and go to the reports about the people of the Hijaz, time and time again, they tell us the people of the Hijaz did not have Hamza in their speech. So now the question is,
so Hijaz, I should have said this at first, but Hijaz is the region where the Quran was proclaimed by the Prophet, Mecca, Medina. So,
and so in this region, they're not supposed to have Hamza. And I would say, if you look at the Quranic consonantal text and a rhyme, it seems to be true that there's no Hamza there. At least wherever you could see it, it rhymes as if it's not there, which is not so many places, but it's like 10 places in the Quran. So that's an indication that there is no Hamza. So, but now all the canonical readers have it. So who put it in there? It's a really interesting question, and it says something about standard language ideology and what people consider proper language. And indeed, if you learn modern standard Arabic today, one of the notable differences between standard Arabic today and the modern vernaculars is that you have to put the Hamza in the right places. So who put the Hamza in? The earliest manuscripts don't have a way of writing the Hamza. There's no sign for it or anything. So everything points to there not being a Hamza. And so there's an interesting, so there's a bit of a historical memory, it seems, in the literary record of this. So in Ibn Mujahid's book, he mentions that the first person to put a Hamza into the recitation. Oh, I'm getting a message that I need to plug in the power, but I still have a little bit of power, so we'll try and go as long as we can.
Because everyone, Marijn is working on a laptop with batteries, has no power, and thanks for
there's no power here, so this is why it's getting gradually darker here as well. They say the first person to put the Hamza in the Quran in Medina is this guy called Muslim bin Jundab, who dies, I think, 110. I don't have the exact, so that's 700 something.
Second half of the 8th century, maybe.
We don't know a lot about this guy's reading, but apparently he was the first one to do it. And we have a couple of other reports. So interestingly, Abu Ja'far, one of the canonical readers of Medina today, in the reading we have has very few Hamzas, but it still has some Hamzas. But there are different transmission paths that are no longer considered canonical, which don't have any Hamza at all. So there seems to be a bit of a historical memory of there being no Hamza, at least in Medina, in the way the Quran was recited, which is in line with actually how the Quran was written and composed. So who put it in? Well, apparently Muslim bin Jundab was the first one to start putting it in. And that clearly took off and really became popular. And very early on, it seems that putting Hamza in your speech was something of a higher register. For some reason, I mean, why do we think putting that consonant in is higher register? I don't know, but that's something that was kind of felt to be around, and many people kind of jump onto that. And that's true even today, right? You cannot speak Fusha, that is standard Arabic, without Hamza. That needs to be in there, and otherwise you're not really speaking Fusha. So that became stronger and stronger until like most of the canonical readers just have Hamza all over the place. But still, even among the canonical ones, so as late as, and they live in late 2nd century, most of them, some of them are still not completely consistent with the Hamza in all places. So it really takes a couple of centuries for that idea that no, if you're speaking proper Arabic, you should not drop the Hamza. You should always keep it. That has kind of been developing over time. So who Hamza'd the Quran? Apparently Muslim bin Jundab. We don't have a lot of evidence about that, but it's a report that exists, and there's something going on there for sure, and we can see that happening in the literary record.
I mean, theologically, all of this is very interesting to me, and you're working on the real sort of technical manuscript and text critical domain, but theologically, it's interesting to consider how Muslims see the community working, with the transmission of the text. Did God protect the community from error in this or that move? But I mean, all of that is, why so much trust in Uthman's work, that project? But that's part of theology, I guess. And I'm in the theology department, so that's maybe my instinct that I should resist. There's a question here which I don't understand, but I think you will. It's from Munzir. I don't know if you saw this go through, Marijn, but he says, is Hafs the only reciter who includes elements of other recitations, such as imala or elision or complete loss of Hamza? Marijn, are you still there? All right, well, the apocalyptic moment, everyone, seems to have arrived, where Marijn has lost the last remaining bits of battery on his laptop. I'm going to carry on here just, a minute or two by responding to a few questions that, I might have something to say to. So you can keep, piling in the questions. Marijn might rejoin. So I'll carry on for a minute or two. If not, we'll definitely get them back. So, I mean, Pradeem, for example, just asks, the Quran seems to be the work of a highly literate person. Is it possible that it was created by someone trained in a monastery or a similar setting? Yeah, so really, really interesting prospect there. Things that could be said about the Quran that, I've written about in different ways. For example, very selfishly, in this new book, is that the Quran is engaging in a profound way with biblical traditions, for example. So it doesn't just like mention Jesus or mention churches or mention Christians. It deals with Christian arguments, theological arguments, and responds to them. There is famously in Quran 16 verse 103, that's Surah An-Nahl, in allusion to someone who seems to speak a non-Arabic language, and there's been a lot of speculation about who that someone might have been. That language is called Ajami. Also, the Quran speaks in certain places, for example, right after the verse, the famous light verse, that's Quran 24, Surah An-Nur, verse 35. If you look at those following verses, 36, 37, there's an allusion to biyut, so houses where people, which God allowed to be raised so that the men would worship him in them, that these are men who are not distracted by tijara or commerce. Is that a reference to monasteries? Very often this is connected with a theory about the Quran is actually Christian. Some Christian was involved with this. My argument is that the Quran is definitely not Christian, but that Christianity was in the context. So I'm just gonna leave that answer there without speculating more. So maybe I'll just add one more thought about the Uthmanic Codex, just maybe to clarify a little bit more the importance of the Sena manuscript. So this is an important bit alluded to by Marijn and what we were just chatting about. But I want to clarify the importance of the Sena manuscript. Someone in the chat already mentioned this, but the Sena, what's called the palimpsest. So this manuscript that has 2 layers of writing, the lower layer of writing in the Sena palimpsest is the only consonantal text which departs from the standard, what's called the Uthmanic consonantal text. So what does that mean? What does that not mean? Okay, what that means is that there's great uniformity among in the manuscripts that have the consonantal standard text, but it does mean that we have at least one bit of evidence that before, presumably, this standard was reached, there were other versions of text around. And in my opinion, Marijn might disagree with this. In my opinion, that it was erased and another text was written on top of it might be a sign that there was active suppression of those variants. That actually more or less matches the standard story of what Uthman did. So if you look at the narrations or the akhbar about the project that Uthman carried out, it's connected with this general Hudhaifa who comes from the frontier to Medina, and he says people are fighting about the text. Let's have a standard text. And not only was a standard text produced through a committee with Zayd ibn Thabit, etc., but a variant standard text, most famously that of Ibn Mas'ud, also Ubay, and others, were destroyed. So I mean, it kind of looks like that kind of thing, except that the text that has now been studied carefully by different folks, that lower text in Sena does not match the reports for any of the neither Ibn Mas'ud nor Ubay. So any of these companion texts that were by tradition destroyed by Uthman, this is not what we have. It's something different. So, I mean, you could argue, this sort of confirms the story in a really general way, but it shows that there was more going on in terms of variants before the establishment of a standard text. In any case, it's not what Marijn is doing with his work and what others like Shadi Nasser have done. The question, what the text does not, the question of the Sena manuscript does not actually pertain to how the Quran is read, because even with the Uthmanic text, there are lots of different possibilities of reading the text, and that's where the Arabic word qira'at, which comes from the verb qara'a, which means to read. So this is where the verb qira'at comes, because even with a standard text, there are many ways of reading it. Now, the tradition said, just as Marijn put out there, 7 were more or less identified in the 10th century with Ibn Mujahid, and then a few centuries later, most famously with Ibn al-Jazari, this is kind of extended to 10. Now, Marijn has shown through his detailed analysis of manuscripts that actually before Ibn Mujahid in the 10th century, there were many other things going on there and different ways that the Quran was being read. So, I mean, even if you accept the standard text, the so-called Uthmanic text, there's still questions about how you read it. I just can't help but add a theological point, which is, there's people put a lot of emphasis on this question, either sort of, wanting to defend that there's one standard text, never changed, vowel for vowel, letter for letter, or wanting to show, oh, there's variants there, and therefore Islamic claims about the text are wrong. I mean, this is not really sort of, I don't know where theology comes in. This is the history of a text, of a book. Theology comes in claims about God and God's relationship to humanity and how God guides humanity and things like that. So I just thought I would add that point. Friends, thank you so much for everyone who joined the live stream. Special thanks, Alf Shukr, 1,000 thanks to Marijn van Putten for joining, even though he had this crisis of the power outage. I'm going to get him back on. I'm sure he's going to say yes, because he's a great guy. His project, again, is Qurcan, the canonization of the Quranic reading traditions. We'll link to that in the description down below. We're going to have another live stream with Marijn. We'll go to even more of your questions. Become a member of Exploring the Quran and the Bible, and then you can send your questions in advance, and I'll make sure to put them at the top of the list. Until next time.